1945. He was already a veteran because Franklin Roosevelt had deputed him and Archibald MacLeish to do a year of public relations across the United States, explaining to the people of the United States what the United States was going to propose in San Francisco, in fact, the draft of the UN Charter, and why it was important and why they ought to support it. And in April 1945, it was estimated that 94% of the people of the United States were in favor of the San Francisco Conference and the United States proposals which were going to be put to the conference. That's a pretty high percentage. In fact, in later years, I sometimes rather wished that Attlee hadn't been quite so successful, because the expectations of the people of the United States on numerous occasions in the future were disappointed. The UN, though essential, was not the perfect solution to all the problems we had after World War II. At the San Francisco conference himself, Adlai Stevenson had the, to put it mildly, interesting job of explaining the United States position on all of the very complicated problems that arose there to what must have been, I should think, the most distinguished collection of American journalists ever assembled. I mean, everyone one's ever heard of was there, from Walter Lippmann on down. In fact, he said, when asked what he was doing, he said, "I'm the official leak." And he was, I must say, a magnificent leak. He had, right from the beginning, being a thoughtful man as well as a wonderful public performer, he had brooded over what he thought would be the weaknesses of the World Organization. Once the world got over the miracle of the end of the war, where it would go wrong. And as early as June 1945, that's before the UN existed, he had said that everything depends on the active participation, the pacific intentions, and the good faith of the Big Five, that is the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Well, very soon after that, the phenomenon which became called the Cold War began in earnest. And it turned out that the UN was based on a fallacy. The UN was based on the proposition that the leaders of the victorious alliance in World War II, including the United States and the Soviet Union, would agree to cooperate in keeping the peace and, if necessary, enforcing it through the United Nations. And of course, the opposite happened. The relations of the 5 permanent members became the major threat to world peace for some 40 years in the Cold War. I first met Adlai Stevenson in the fall of 1945 in London, and Senator Stephen has recalled the Stevenson home, which was indeed a great center for the people who were trying to set the United Nations up. It was the Preparatory Commission. It was an extremely distinguished body, consisting, as Senator Stevens said, of all sorts of extremely impressive people, starting with Gladwin Jebb, who was the executive secretary, who had had a major part in drafting the UN Charter in San Francisco. I was his private secretary, as it was then called. Gromyko, Ernest Bevin, the British foreign minister, an old Labour hand, Jan Masaryk, Lester Pearson of Canada, and so on. It was an amazing, I just got out of the army, having been in it for 6 years, and I was absolutely astonished at what went on in this gathering. These people mostly knew each other, but there wasn't any question, really, who the stars of the group were. And they were, number one, Adlai Stevenson, the American representative, who had a really astonishing capacity not just for getting what he wanted, but actually getting other people to believe they wanted it too, which is quite a trick. He was a person naturally very witty, and he was a brilliant speaker, but he never overdid it. And the result was he was extremely effective. He had great personal charm and an enormous capacity for putting in eloquent words some kind of common purpose that people could get around and support. In fact, Andrei Gromyko, as you rightly said, your father was one of the very few people who could make Gromyko laugh, though he was a little bit more cheerful when young. And Gromyko made this rather touching attempt to respond to Adley's wit and wonderful capacity for argument and for putting ideas forward. He used to make jokes himself. That was pretty heavy going, I have to admit. They were very, and it was a great tribute to Adlai Stevenson. This supposedly Mr. No from the Soviet Union would really try to enter into this sort of collegial, jokey spirit. It was interesting. He was the life and soul of that body, along with Gladwin Jebb and Lester Pearson. And it was a time when people were so anxious to believe in the world organization that was going to be set up, and anxious to think that it was going to work as, but everybody, particularly the American delegation, said it was going to, and anxious to believe that all the horrible loss and sadness and destruction of World War II in the end had actually meant something. And I think he embodied that feeling in a remarkable way. And we were all, I have to say, not just enchanted, but tremendously inspired by it. And that was the time when I saw him, I think really at the height of his great abilities and at the height of his great humanity. This was really something to see, a human being who could, after 6 years of misery and destruction and death and pain, painting this new world, which wasn't simple at all. I mean, he didn't cut corners. He just was able to say, we have to try this and that, these are very difficult things, we will do them, and so on. And he brought along the Preparatory Commission. The Preparatory Commission adopted a unanimous report, which was something that became less and less likely later on when you had the United States and the West and the Soviet Union in the same room. In fact, it was almost unique. I didn't see Adlai Stevenson again, really, until he came here as the ambassador. And Dick, I think, has given a wonderful account of all the things that they were not only trying to do, but actually did in that really splendid delegation. We saw him, I was then working for Ralph Bunche, with another very remarkable person. Somebody who incidentally was a great friend of Adlai Stevenson. They got on extremely well. We used to see quite a lot of Adlai Stevenson. He was quite exasperated on the political side with his difficulties with Washington. He was not a member of the Kennedy group. He was forced almost instantly to defend things which he had no use for at all, like the Bay of Pigs. And later on, under President Johnson, of course, the situation in Vietnam, which again he was not, in any sense, the least bit happy about, and I think he found it very difficult. But that didn't mean that he wasn't still the old Adlai, and as everybody has mentioned, that came out in the major crisis, I suppose, of the century, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when in the room next door, in the Security Council, he suddenly produced these enormous aerial photographs showing the Soviet missile sites, and engaged in the extremely famous colloquy with Valerian Zorin, who was a famous Soviet hatchet man. And I think there wasn't any doubt who got the worst of the conversation. Almost the best thing in it was when Zorin complained he was being treated like a criminal in the dock by a prosecutor. And as somebody has said already, Stevenson said, you are in the court of world opinion. And he couldn't answer that. It was a very striking performance, and I think it did predispose not just the people in the Security Council, but the world at large to the extreme, deadly seriousness of that crisis. I mean, I can remember that crisis for all sorts of reasons. One was when two people who owned a great number of extremely valuable pictures in New York rang up and said, should they leave with the pictures for the Middle West? I mean, people were expecting the place to be blown to glory, but it was, and I think Adley's performance in the Security Council somehow framed the whole thing in a way which was extremely helpful to everybody, including, incidentally, the Russians, who were, having got themselves into this, were extremely anxious to get out of it, because nobody was less anxious to have a nuclear war than they were. I think that it's difficult to answer about someone of this kind, someone who was so important in the present, as to what they would do about the future. I think that of course, Adlai Stevenson was one of the earliest proponents and supporters of the United States as the builder of a strong international organization, who believed not just in the unique position of the United States, especially after World War II, when it was incomparably the most powerful state in history. There had never been anything like it, but where leadership took the form of courtesy and grace and cooperation and help, and there was not a sign of coercion or bullying. And he was a master of this method, which I think, in a curious way, was everybody's finest hour. I mean, it was extremely unusual for the United States to lose a decision, simply because the world was so impressed by this approach. He obviously would have thought that the Security Council should be more unanimous and more effective, and that to some extent has happened after the Cold War. I don't know about peacekeeping. He certainly would want to strengthen it, but peacekeeping is not viewed in quite the same way it used to be. I mean, I'm one of the very few people who keeps reminding people that in 1958, John Foster Dulles sponsored a resolution to the joint houses of Congress suggesting a permanent peacekeeping force. The person who was terribly doubtful about it was the Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, who thought it was premature. And now it's practically a criminal offense to suggest a standing peacekeeping force in some quarters. But I think he would have wanted to really get the place working on a practical, unflashy way, which really produced results. And I think that he was a great proponent of diplomacy and firmness, of the iron fist and the velvet glove, the way to go things. And I think that is his legacy, and I hope very much that we're getting back to a lot of that now. I think we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for those special and I think very valid and valuable perspectives. And now it's my pleasure to present Bill Vanden Heuvel. Bill is a product of upstate New York, a graduate of Deep Springs College and Cornell University, and the Cornell Law School, where he was editor-in-chief of the Law Review, came to the New York Bar in 1952. He was an early close associate of William Joseph Donovan, and Bill served in the U.S. Embassy in the 50s in Bangkok, Thailand, and as Donovan's executive assistant afterward in the Office of Strategic Services. He was counsel to New York State Governor Averell Harriman, became U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy's assistant in 1962, and was involved in Kennedy's 64 and 68 political campaigns. Bill served as ambassador to the European Office of the United Nations in Geneva in the late 70s,